So my name is Robert Layton, and today I'll just give you a sort of an introduction to startups, both generally what to do with them, but also specifically what's happening in Ballarat in that region, in that area. For those online that aren't from Ballarat, half of this talk is going to be quite uninteresting, but hopefully the other half's quite interesting. So just as a warning, there's going to be lots of time for questions, so think of one now, yeah, plenty of time for discussion. So one of the key things, I suppose, with a talk like this is making sure that everyone sort of gets their questions answered, and I didn't want to sort of focus too much on what I wanted to say, and just wanted to make sure that we cover all the important topics. So to give you a little bit of background about myself, I was a student here from about 2003 to 2011-ish or 12-ish. I did a Bachelor of Computing here, and then did honours, and then did a PhD after that. My honours project was with Peter Vamplew and Richard Daisley, who some of you probably met, we created a poker bot, basically. So I was in artificial intelligence. My claim to fame there is it lost slowly against the best bots in the world, which we're pretty happy with over just 1 year. From there, I did a PhD with the Internet Commerce Security Laboratory, and my research there was on cybercrime attribution. So looking at the way in which cybercriminals did their attacks in order to work out whether the same attack was done by two attacks were done by the same person or not. That was research done in conjunction with Westpac and IBM, and the Australian Federal Police were also partners of the lab. From there, I did research here for a couple of years after that, it was during that time when I first started working with a startup. That startup was RedMarker. RedMarker was text analysis for regulatory assistance, basically. So their standard product was looking at blog posts and online social media, basically to determine whether people were breaking the law when they were suggesting financial products. The basic premise there is, if you're a financial advisor, you're not allowed to go online and say, we guarantee you'll get 6% return on investment. That's the thing you're not allowed to say. You have to always put a disclaimer saying past returns are not an indication of future performance and all that sort of stuff. It's a regulation, but it's pretty much law. So I wrote their prototype, so their very first version, which basically proved that the concept worked, and I did that as a project through the university here. And that was sort of my first startup. Now, Mandy, who runs and ran RedMarker, is a serial entrepreneur herself, and she had already had one exit, so it was great to be able to learn from her and sort of see what startups are like. I wouldn't work again for RedMarker for about 4 years or so, but then a year and a half ago I did a year of work for her, or for them, and then they were sold to Kaplan. So Kaplan are a very large multinational training provider, and they purchased RedMarker for some obscene amount of money. So that was not my doing, but it was off the back of some of the work I did, and I was very happy to be a part of that process there. So that was my first sort of introduction to startups. Now, I found the research game a little bit not for me. Waiting a year to get a journal paper back and having to revisit stuff you've already done and that sort of stuff didn't work with me very well. So I decided to go on my own and create a business. So my first business was, it's called Data Pipeline, and it's data analytics consultancy. So I still do that on the side, but it's not my main focus at the moment. couple of years ago, probably about 4, I think, I met with a couple of guys in Ballarat who wanted to open basically a shared space for people to tinker and learn electronics and 3D printing, and that's the Ballarat Hackerspace. We opened that first. We rented space out, or we didn't rent. We were given space for 2 hours a week at a Pilates centre, at which point we had to unpack all of our electronics, then pack it all up again and hope we didn't leave resistors and capacitors on the ground. After we did that for, I think, 6 months or so, we decided this is a thing that's sticking around, so we rented space, and that was version 1 of the Ballarat Hackerspace. And we were in the SMB campus on Lydiard Street there in what was affectionately called the dungeon, and we had maybe 3 small windows of sunlight coming in. Giant windows pointing to a building, but the actual windows that got sunlight were very tiny. And we got that space basically because no one else was getting it. No one else wanted it. So we were there for quite a while, and recently we moved to a new space in Albert Street, which is 200 square metres with lots of natural lighting and lots of space in the tech school. So we're not part of the tech school, we're in the tech school building, and just on the upper floor of the south side. So the Ballarat Hackerspace is a non-profit, so that's not my job. But in meeting with those guys, basically we're running the Hackerspace, and we found that we constantly get people coming in saying, I've got a startup idea, can you build an app for me? And the Hackerspace is not the right vehicle for that. It's a community learning centre basically, and we basically kept telling people, oh no, we can't do that for you. If you want to learn how to make the app yourself, that's what we're for. But people weren't really interested in that. So we identified a need, and that's a word I'm going to come back to later, but we identified that there was a need in the market for people to be able to get their prototype built. It's different from a normal software house in that, you know, if you're running a software house and you have 6 programmers on your team and stuff like that, your aim is to sell lots of software. So you're going to take their spec and go, okay, that'll be $200,000. And for someone who just wants to try out an idea, they're going to go, no. But if you're hiring staff, that's sort of that's how you make a business, by charging lots of money to sell lots of software. So there was a part of the market there where we wanted quick turnaround, small projects, and also a bit of flexibility in the scope of the project too. In any startup, you have some assumptions about how the world works. You quickly find out most of those are wrong, and then you have to change scope and build something else instead. If you're a software house and you've got a big contract that outlines what you're going to do and how much it's going to cost and stuff like that, it's very hard to change that. But for a startup, that's sort of what you have to do. So with Ian and Scott, we formed a company called Eurecative, and the scope of that company is to build prototypes for startups. So we're flexible, basically. We do very small projects. We did a project for $350, which if you go to any place that has bricks around it, they will charge you that for walking in the door. But this person only needed a website. It was a very simple website, like 16 lines of JavaScript or something like that. But it was enough to get it online and be able to identify, it solved her problem, but nobody else really cared. So rather than wasting thousands of dollars on getting the full solution for her, she was able to quickly test something and realize, I'm probably not going to make money out of this. That's still working, by the way. It's still up there. There's no reason to take it down yet, but just nobody uses it. So Eurecative is what I mainly do now. So I work with quite a number of startups, building prototypes and doing development work for them. And so flexibility is the key there. the aim is that eventually those startups will get their own funding or get their own customers, and they'll hire staff to replace us, basically. And that's our goal. Our goal is to be replaced because if they can't replace us, then we haven't done our job properly in developing their first version. The other good thing about where we're up to is we get to build the prototype, we get to solve the interesting part, and then handball it off to someone else to do the maintenance and long-term stuff. And so again, that's our goal. I've also done quite a bit of work with a company called Python Charmers, and this is training work, so I teach programming. That job has taken me to quite a few, well, probably about 300 participants over the last couple of years, and I've met quite a lot of other people that have needs and stuff like that. So through that, we're able to identify, different projects that people have or different needs they have, and being able to talk to lots of people and learn how different people do their jobs. So some of the people who do Python Charmers are scientists, some are data scientists themselves, and they know how to do their stuff in R and they need to learn how to do it in Python. But being able to listen to those different problems and identify what they need has been a real eye-opener for me, basically, to be able to get that extra information. And that's something I'll come back to later, but one of the key things that I'll talk about later in any startup is being able to find out what people's problems are, because ultimately they're going to give you money to solve those problems, so you have to work out how to find those problems. So, so now what I do predominantly is run Eurecative and help run the hackerspace, and I do that predominantly from the new Fleckno building, which is open. So this is in Ballarat. It's Albert Street in Ballarat. Important to note, that's not Albert Street, Sebastopol. Albert Street, if you just say Albert Street to someone who's lived in Ballarat for a long time, they'll go to Sebastopol, and apparently it's an empty block, so don't go there. Albert Street, Ballarat, is just around the corner from the police station, which is a nice way of saying just down the road from Centrelink. It's a brand new, well, it's recently refurbished. So it used to be the engineering and plumbing part of SMB campus. So basically, if you're between the ages of, I think, 35 and 55 or something like that, and you're a plumber in Ballarat, you were trained there. But then for the last 20 years or so, it's been basically derelict or close to it, severely underused. And recently the Victorian government put in money to do that building up, and now it looks quite awesome. We've got a 200 square metre co-working space there. We've got a fab lab, so we've got professional or prosumer grade 3D printers and a laser cutter and milling machine and electronic stuff. We're getting a sewing machine. There's lots of cool stuff there to build prototypes, basically. So I live most of my time there and home, but predominantly there. So that's what I do now. One of the other things I was going to say during my opening is about 2 years ago, we were looking for co-working space, basically, and it didn't exist. There is a sore point in Ballarat's history, in its recent history, around this space. There was a big push to get a co-working space effectively in Ballarat, and it fell through, and quite suddenly and quite heavily. And if you ask any of the people who are involved about it, they try not to talk to you. It is, I don't know exactly what happened, but it didn't happen, which was disappointing because Scott, Ian and myself were all independently looking at that project going, I can't wait for it to open because I'm going to be there. And then it didn't happen. And we basically decided, well, one needs to exist, so we made one. We got a partnership with the university, got some space, and opened Lab 79, which we say is Ballarat's first co-working space. In our marketing, we say it's the premier co-working space in Ballarat. It all depends on how you want to define co-working, whether it was the first one or not. There's plenty of places in Ballarat where you can get small offices or share an office or something like that, but they weren't really co-working. So we ran Lab 79 on a very casual, low-touch basis. Basically, the invoicing was you turn up, you log onto the Wi-Fi, and then it automatically does everything else, which was really good for us because we didn't want to actually run a co-working space. We just needed one. But that idea of, you find a need and you just go out and do it is one of the key things, I think, for us for the startup area. So rather than spend a lot of time, and a lot of money to do it, we worked out what the fastest and the quickest way to get there, and the cheapest way as well. Okay, so Lab 79, as of 3 weeks ago, is no longer a thing. We kickstarted this in Ballarat, but now there's 2 places to go for co-working in Ballarat, so we don't need to be involved anymore. The first is the Fleckno building that I was talking about before. There's heaps of co-working space there. And just as an aside, there's talks about having students be in there. So if you are interested in that, then I'm not sure who you'd talk to, but send me an email, and if I know any more, I'll let you know. So Runway is the company that runs that space, and Eurekative help Runway. There's also Platypus Co-working, which is on Lydia Street above PRD, so Lydia Street South. So both those places are within like 150 metres of each other. That was coincidence more than anything, but it works out good. So there wasn't anything, then there was us, now there's 2 options, and there's actually a couple of other options as well. So there's a co-working space specifically for women, and I think that's invite only. There's talk about a co-working space particularly for immigrants who want to get into business in the area. And then at the sort of next level up, there's small office space through both place near Central Square, which I forget its name, and also the Ballarat Business Centre just opened a new place in Sturt Street. So the infrastructure is definitely there now if you want to do a startup. The key thing with all of this is there's a growing group of us in Ballarat that really want to push startups as being the third option. And what I mean by third option is if you're 14 and you talk to your parents about what you want to do when you grow up, in the past there's really just been 2 options. There's been go to university or do a trade. And that's been quite strongly ingrained in Australia's culture for quite a long time. It's those 2 things or bust, basically. But we want to push startups or starting your own company as a real third option. This is obviously not a new thing. Startups and small businesses have been around forever, but the difference in mentality that comes with having, I won't say normal people, but having lots of people do their own small business is not there in Australia. If your mum or dad ran a business, then you might be more inclined to do that. But if they didn't, it's a very weird option. It's a point where people will try and talk you out of it. I had that. I know other people who started a small business who've had people actively say, like, don't do this, you're going to ruin yourself or something like that. And it is risky. There is a very high element of risk. The difference is what happens after that. So if you do run a small business and it does fail, a lot of people think, okay, well, that's it. You're just going to live off Centrelink for the rest of your life because you have no experience and you've been shown to be a failure. When in reality, that's not true. Even a failed business teaches you lots. And I think a lot of people are starting to realise that people who tried a business and it didn't work can still be employed, and they still do a lot. And if anything, it's good experience, not bad experience. Startups basically work like this in a lot of the big startup places. So Silicon Valley or Israel, and for instance, if you aren't part of failing startups as a regular part of your life, you're not doing it right. And also, when you go to get your next job after a failure, people look at what you actually did, not the outcome of the business, which is partially under your control, but also a large part of it's not. So we want to push for that sort of culture change here, to be able to say you can go do a startup, you can take that risk, make sure you learn from it, but then if it does fail, there is life after that. So that's one of the things we want to check. But that said, failure is not the goal. Success is, and having that infrastructure in place to ensure success is as likely as possible is what one of the key things that we're trying to do in Ballarat at the moment. So as I mentioned, a couple of years ago, there was no co-working space in Ballarat. A friend of mine was looking for co-working space and basically got offered $11,000 a year rent for a small office. Like, not the point. I want to work with people, and I want to, cross ideas with them and stuff like that. But now that exists, 12 months ago, there wasn't a network really to join if you wanted to start a startup in Ballarat. Not to say people haven't been. People have been making startups in Ballarat and the surrounding regions for a long time, just sort of by themselves or travelling down to Melbourne. And we know these people exist because we find new ones every single week. But there was never really that nexus point where people could come together and talk about that. People just sort of assumed that they were the only ones doing it and didn't really seek out other people, or occasionally they would Google for startup Ballarat and nothing would come up, so they stopped. We have that nexus point now, so that's the Fleckno building and runway. Yeah. So that infrastructure is definitely getting there. And then just to really drive that point home, the City of Ballarat just got a 6-figure grant to basically promote startups in Ballarat. So we're working with the City of Ballarat on part of that project. There's going to be social media stuff and websites and all that sort of stuff. But it's basically around that first 2 stages of a startup's life cycle, which is basically getting people together and creating ideas. So there'll be co-working trials, so you'll be able to get free co-working days. The first one of those is November 8th at Platypus, so it'll be free. I think you have to RSVP, but otherwise you just turn up. So free co-working days, and then hackathons and stuff like that to try and get those ideas happening. So that'll be funded through the City of Ballarat, through LaunchVic. The Fleckno building upgrade was a 7-figure grant and quite a big deal. So that was all about building innovation in the area. Innovation these days means startups, but it's not necessarily the case. So that was a very big deal. And there's been a lot of work done over the last couple of years on promoting that, not just in Melbourne, but specifically in the regional areas. Just on that, long term, I have a hypothesis about the world, which is something we'll come back to later, and that's that people are going to start moving away from cities. So at the moment, standard economics theory, which has been completely true for the last 100 or 150 years, has basically said that people congregate into cities because that's where skills are. So if you're a world-class physician, there's only really one place that you need to be, and that's in the city. So people come to see you, so you need to be somewhere central or somewhere with good infrastructure so people come and get you. But you want to work with other world-class physicians, so you go to where they are. And people just sort of naturally congregate into cities that way, particularly higher skilled jobs. And then those higher skilled jobs are in the middle of cities, and then the support network for those is around those, and the support network for those is around those, and that's how you build out cities. But there's a reason I'm in Ballarat, and that's because whenever I travel to Melbourne, people are not smiling. I'm a firm believer that cities are not fun places, and basically moving into regional areas is better for your lifestyle. The problem with that has always been jobs. So if you want to stay in Ballarat, So for instance, when I finished my bachelor, research was not the first option. I applied for lots of jobs, but did not get anything, nothing substantial. And the reason for that is I didn't have exactly the right experience and there weren't that many jobs. So I applied for nearly every job that said computer somewhere in it, but yeah, nothing really panned out. And I did have a lack of experience, and thinking back now, I probably could have done applications better or something like that. But when you're in Melbourne, there's just lots of these jobs, so there's more available, and you can get that experience easier and stuff like that. In the near future, I see that sort of flipping on its head. So a lot of people are now working from home more, or if they're not working from home all the time, they're working from home 2 days a week or 3 days a week or something like that. And they're really only congregating to have meetings, basically. All the other work can be done independently, or you can talk on Skype or Slack or something like that. You don't need to be in the same room anymore. So I see this as being a real turning point in that standard economics theory that said now people don't have to congregate in the city. Maybe the business people will, because business people are all about talking to each other and being in the same room. But even that's changing. But at least for techies, moving out to regional areas is a very big trend at the moment. We see quite a few people who have moved away from Melbourne into Ballarat. And these are people who are very high-level software developers, and they still work for the same person, they still do the same job they did. Now they just do it from their house instead of travelling into the city or dealing with that traffic. So I do believe there's a future in the regional areas, so that's one of the reasons why I'm here and why I'm pushing for startups, particularly in Ballarat. So there is quite a lot of thought going into that. Okay, so but that said, we're not at that stage yet where that's happened. We're in that stage where it's happening. And there are some things missing. So one of the key things that's missing is IT skills for startups. Courses, particularly at the University of Ballarat, when I went there, were really focused around big business and being able to train you up to be a really good big business programmer. And Feduni still do that in some of the degrees, but in others they're very different skills. Startups need more broad skills, and the shape that we, or the word we suggest for those is T-shaped, something like that. So a T-shaped, or a person with T-shaped skills has a broad range, or shallow but broad range of skills across the board. So they know a bit about networking, a bit about programming, a bit about development and deployment, all that sort of stuff. And then they specialise in one area. So they might know everything about data mining, but then they also know how to deploy the model and make a website around it and stuff like that as well. So these T-shaped skills are necessary for startups, particularly early on. Because if you're the first programmer at a startup, you're going to do everything. And you have to do it quickly, and you have to do it with at least some knowledge that people are going to be relying on that as the only system. And if it goes down, you're the one that fixes it because nobody else knows anything about it. So being able to have that breadth of knowledge as well as the specialisation is very key. So being able to find IT people that have this T-shape is difficult. They exist, and there's some in the room right now, but the other difficulty is convincing them to take a risk on a startup. So if you've already got a job and you're already making, I don't know, a fairly good wage, taking the risk to jump over to a startup and getting equity instead, can't eat equity. So it's a big risk, and unless you really believe in the startup, it's a very hard one to take. So we're also trying to change that mindset to say that there should be some element of risk, but also there should be that underlying support structure to say if you are failing, then there's people that can help you and get you over the line. So that is one problem that we have regionally, which is access, particularly to IT skills. So we don't have a capability problem. The people are here. We have a capacity problem. There's not enough of them. Yeah, it's just one thing that I'm conscious of. The other things that we are lacking in Ballarat that are being addressed are things like support to funding. So Runway are working on a Ballarat Angels investor fund to get that very early seed funding for startups. And angels are basically, they'll give you money on a very high risk, basically. So they're well aware that, you're 3 months into the project or something like that, and it may just fall over, and there's a very high risk of that. They're well aware of that. They get in early because if you do succeed, they've got a large chunk of the company and they're going to multiply their money quite a lot. So that's that sort of a very early stage funding that's being addressed at the moment, and that Ballarat Angels Investor Network exists and is starting to grow. So there's definitely options for funding now. Past that, into say Series A and Series B funding, there's not much of that in Ballarat. And it's possible that there might not be for a very long time. For that, you'd still have to travel to Melbourne or Sydney if you're a fintech or something like that. It depends on what type of startup you are. That said, even Melbourne people are lamenting about the lack of funding there, so maybe it's an Australian thing, not a Ballarat thing. Cool. All right, so because my notes are everywhere, I've got a random side point to make here. The average age of a successful startup founder, so the keyword there is successful. So someone who creates a business and either exits or goes public. And it varies depending on who you ask, but actually I might throw this to the audience. Does anyone want to take a guess? Average age of a successful startup founder?
I would say like
Late 20s?
I would say early mid-30s.
Early mid-30s? Mid-20s? No?
Early 30s.
45. So 45 is definitely not the Mark Zuckerbergs, who was successful, I think 22 or something like that. Those people do exist, but they're unusual, which is why they're so newsworthy. The normal, not run-of-the-mill, but the normal sort of startup founder, when they're successful, is 45. And there's a key reason for that. It's because they've got experience. So they're solving problems that actually exist out in the world. When you're in your early 20s, your problems are not everyone else's problems, and you don't have money, which means people like you don't have money. So trying to sell to that market's very difficult. So getting that real world experience and having that background to be able to say, I know all the people that do forestry imaging, and I know what their problems are, and I know how to solve those. That's a success. That's a start of a successful startup. It's not, I think more people should ride bikes, so I'm going to put them everywhere and get them to ride bikes. That's not a successful startup because that's not a need people have. People aren't throwing money at bike manufacturers. If anything, that's declining. So, and I think when you're in your early 20s, you sort of hope more than more practical. So, so my recommendation, if you are in your early 20s, is actually to join someone else's startup, or to, if you have an interest in, say, forestry imaging or something like that, is to go work in that field for a while. A lot of news articles talk about, say, the Ubers. So Uber had, the people who founded Uber weren't taxi drivers or in the industry at all. They identified that taxis suck, and they worked their way towards a better solution. The fact that they were industry outsiders is unusual. So again, most startup founders actually have domain experience and actually know what the problems are. They might have a new way of solving those problems, but they're definitely knowledgeable about the area. And then if you think about Mark Zuckerberg, like the very early versions of Facebook were to college students. So One of the things that he had going for him was he was a college student, so he marketed heavily towards college students in the early stages of Facebook. Facebook wasn't actually publicly accessible for many years, so it wasn't really a public space for a while. Actually, it was weird when parents started signing up to it. It's just weird. Okay, so, all right, so back to my crazy notes. There's a guy that you should read pretty much everything he wrote on startups if you have an interest in the area, and that's Paul Graham. So he's part of Y Combinator. Y Combinator is one of the most successful startup accelerators in the world. Dropbox and I think Uber and a whole bunch of other really large companies went through Y Combinator. And Paul Graham's a very intelligent person. He's been doing startups for a long time. And there's a blog article that he has on starting the startup. And it's from 2005. And it's still relevant. So that sort of shows you how much he's into the area. And he says you need three things for a successful startup. You need an idea, which everyone sort of focuses on, but it's actually the least important of the three things. You need people, and you need customers. So we get people coming to us occasionally and saying, I've got a great idea, I just need you to code it, and when we're done. But the problem is ideas are cheap, and they're actually never as good as what you think they are. And if you want proof of this, go have a look at what Uber did in its first year of operation, because it's not what it's doing now. Go have a look at how Facebook started, and go have a look at how all these big companies started. Very few of them actually are doing the idea that they started with. They all started with a clever idea or something maybe a little bit unusual, but it's all about execution after that point, and execution is about the last one. So ideas are cheap, but you still need one to start. You need to say, I think that people are going to pay money if I deliver them food. That's the idea. Lots of other people have had that idea, but you still need that idea to get started. That's, I suppose, the other thing about ideas is if you've had the idea, it's very likely someone else has had it or is already working on it. Just because you can't find a company doesn't mean there's not one hidden or something somewhere. So that brings us to the next one. So you've got your idea. The next thing you need is people. So you need T-shaped skilled techies to be able to do all your infrastructure and all your coding by themselves, and then get you started. But you also need business skills and mentors. Going it alone is really not a good option. If you can't convince other people to help you, it's probably not an idea worth continuing with. And if you can't convince those people, or you can't convince anyone, then you've got to really seriously consider the idea from an external point of view and think about whether can you not sell, which is going to be a problem later, or is it a bad idea, or both. So you convince people to join you. This could be getting a co-founder on board and saying, I'll give you half the company, and then you do half the work. It could be just getting a mentor and saying, I'm going to be in the shipping industry, you've done shipping for 20 years, can you tell me what you know about the industry? Or it could just be business advisors and stuff like that. This is the area that we're building at the moment. So being able to have that nexus point of people in Ballarat is one that's been missing, and that's what we're working on. The other thing you need is customers. Customers are not random people. Customers are people prepared to give you money for what you're trying to sell. Customers are tricky because they're not you. They think differently to you, and you need to work out how to get what they want or what they need out of them. So this is that word need that I came up with before. So everyone has needs, whether it's their car's too slow or whether their food's not delicious enough or whatever it is. People have needs and they're prepared to spend money on those needs. How much money? Depends on how strong the need is, basically. If someone's on fire, they'll spend a lot of money for a bucket of water. But you need to be able to find those needs. So customers have needs, and if your product, it doesn't matter how good your product is, if it doesn't solve someone's need, they're not going to be a customer. Or maybe your mum will buy a couple or something, a couple of objects just to make you feel good, but she's not going to buy another one after that. So you need to look for customers and have a need. If you have an idea, but you don't have any customers, what you've got there is a hobby. And it's fine to have hobbies, just don't expect to make money out of them. And when you start a startup, there is a certain procedure most people get you to do, and that's to fill out a lean canvas. So lean canvas. This is a one-page business strategy. And basically, the first question asks you, who are your customers? That's the most important part of that whole process, is who are your customers. There's other important bits, like how you can actually reach them, or what are their problems and stuff like that, but who are your customers? Early on, your customers are going to be a very niche audience. It could be, mums aged between 35 and 45 who used to work from home but now are looking for a job. So it's a very niche audience, very specific, and you want specific. You want to be too niched to the point of being uncomfortable. If you try and create something that's for everyone, you create something that's for nobody, and nobody's really going to spend money because it doesn't really solve a particular person's need. And if you look at the, again, biggest companies in the world, even those that do spread to a lot of people, there really is a focus audience on them, or there used to be. So Facebook's was college students, and quite heavily only college students for a while. You needed a .edu address to be able to sign up for Facebook in the early days. And one from a particular university, and they only added universities one at a time as the server could handle it. So they had a particular niched customer area. Yeah, if you don't have that niche, then it's very hard to actually tell people what your company's about, and to also try and focus your marketing efforts to try and find them. So if you're just advertising to everybody, well then do you put ads in the newspaper, or do you go to Facebook ads, or do you get a banner or something like that? All these options are different depending on who you're trying to market to. So, so you need that need and you need the niche. Two critical parts there. Okay, so so those are the three things: idea, people, and customers that Paul Graham speaks about as being necessary for a startup. But then he goes on for another like 2,000 words about describing all of this. But I recommend reading that article, and then just clicking next and reading all the rest of it as well. On people, Paul Graham writes a lot of good stuff on it, but there are, you want this T-shaped, but there are actually two requirements for hiring people that are not necessarily tech skills. You need people that are smart, and that's generally smart. You're not looking, you're not always particularly looking for smart in a particular area, but you just want someone that's smart and is able to pick up new ideas and reason about them and that sort of stuff. But then the other attribute you need is get things done. If someone has both of those qualities and no other specific skills that are relevant, they're probably still a good hire. If they're smart, they can pick up new things quickly. If they get things done, they're going to deliver. You can have people that are smart that don't get things done. This is the cliche academic that always works in his study and knows everything there is about a particular method or something like that, but never actually produces anything worthwhile. Most academics are not that, but that's the cliche anyway. So if they're smart but don't get things done, then they're nice people to talk to, but don't give them money to deliver anything. If they get things done but they're not smart, then this is dangerous because they're going to deliver a whole bunch of stuff that probably takes you backwards and might take a lot of work just to fix what they've done rather than go forward. So you definitely don't want that option. Obviously, if they're neither of those things, you shouldn't be giving them money or equity in your company. But if they've got both of those things, then grab a hold of them because you're going to need them. Now, the person who came up with these two things is Joel Splosky. I don't know, if you put that into Google, then Google will fix that spelling. And he's written quite a lot on hiring for tech people, but the same sort of applies to startups. All right, how are we going for time? That took, yeah, that was unexpected. All right, so coming up with those three things is very important. So as I mentioned before, the average age of a successful co-founder is 45. So if you're younger than that, you might still succeed, but it's probably this idea stage that's you're going to struggle with. If you are in your early 20s, you probably also don't know that many people who are very successful and are able to help you. So you do want to build that network as well. So on that, on the people side of it, you definitely need a team. And if you don't have a team, it's going to be very, very hard to succeed. Startups are a lot of work. They're more work than you think they are. And they're more work than what you now think they are. And we can keep doing that for a while. A startup probably needs to be in your top 3 priorities. So if you have a family that you care about and friends that you care about and a hobby that you really like, one of those 3 things has to go. Because you probably just don't have enough time for a startup or enough mental energy to do one successfully. So it is brutal, but it's probably the truth. And there are certain people who are always going to be exceptions to these rules, but I'm really talking about the majority of people. And when lots of people make a startup, you want, say, 50% of them to be successful or 10% to be successful, whatever number it is. But when you make a startup, you want you to be successful, and you want a 100% chance of that happening. So you need to be really focused on that. Okay, so I had a couple of other things here, but I'll leave those for now. The last thing I want to talk about, which sticks on this community, sticks on this people side, is mental health. So startups are stressful. They are lots of work, and you'll find that everything you think about the world is wrong, and it'll break you, and it'll find all your weak points. Like if you're not good at sales, that's going to drag the whole company down, especially if you're the only person or you're one of 3 people. If you're not good at programming, then that's going to bring the company, or it's going to drag the company slower. And so startups will find these weaknesses in you, and that's hard. One of the key things to to be aware of when you are working in startups and that sort of thing is your mental health. You need to build a community of people around you, not necessarily in the startup, but also keep active with your friends and your family and stuff like that. A lot of people get stressed and then isolate themselves, and that's exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing in that scenario. And also you need to take time off and recharge and that sort of stuff as well. There's a saying that you can't pour from an empty glass. If you are running out of steam, then your work is not going to be as good as it should be. So you need to get your sleep and do exercise and all that sort of stuff, and go out with friends and family. So mental health is a big deal in startup land. Lots of startup founders suffer from either anxiety or depression, or imposter syndrome is a big one. Imposter syndrome is so a lot of people know about anxiety and depression, but imposter syndrome hits pretty much everyone. And the worst part about it is it hits you when you're succeeding. So you might have a startup and then you go get a huge amount of funding and you go, I'm not actually that smart, I don't deserve this. And then it niggles at you. And that's a big part of startups, is dealing with yourself, basically. So my key takeaway there is to build that community and keep in touch with people, and don't isolate yourself when those problems hit. Okay, so that's pretty much all I'll talk about today. So as you can probably imagine, I can talk about this for a lot longer, but I won't. If you want to get a hold of me, my email address is rob@...
Can you make it a little bit bigger, please?
I can. All right. So, no, not with that texter. Yeah. So it's rob@eurekative.com.au. Hopefully, if you Google my name, it comes up with me. There is also a paleontologist in Australia called Robert Layton. Don't email him. Which was annoying, because even when I was doing research, I wasn't the lead result for Robert Layton's in Australia in research. So that niggled. But anyway, email me if you've got any questions. If you want to create a startup, then that's great. If you don't have those three things, you might not have specific customers, but you might know who they are and how to get in touch with those. That's fine. If you don't have those three things, then still let me know if you're interested. I know lots of startups. Those startups are looking for people to help. Whether you get paid or not immediately is a different question, but some of the startups actually pay you. But it might be taking a risk as well. So feel free to send me an email if you've got any questions or you want to catch up at a later point in time. And yeah, if you've got any questions, I'll take them now. Otherwise, thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks. Cool. Any questions?
Cool.
No, that's all right.
Quick
Cool.
reading on this, that's the main thing. All right.
Awesome.
Kill this off. For those watching on the stream, we're back about 5 minutes with the next one. So, hold on.